Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Senate Economic Development. We're going to be talking about two things this morning and maybe get back a little bit to workforce if we have time. But we're talking about sports betting and the SALT deduction cap. The idea here is to see if we have the bandwidth to go deeper than studies on both of these programs. And the last time we talked about sports betting, I think the commissioner, Tucker Anderson, said that they would help us find people in other states that have gone through similar experiences to share that with us and see how, what is the phrase? Something to something.
Speed to market.
Very good. Speed to market. So I am going to ask you, Tucker, to take the seat, and in 5 minutes or so, tell us what the draft does that would get this thing up and running so that we can establish some get this up and running legally and start collecting revenue from shy away from as being the black market right now. And I want you to just, even though you've done that already for us, I want some of the other people in the room to hear it so they can pick up on that and comment on your description of where we are.
Good morning, everyone. Tucker Anderson, Office of Legislative Counsel. The proposal that you have in front of you would implement a state control model in Vermont for the sports wagering market. It would delegate responsibility and regulatory authority over the sports wagering market to the Department of Liquor and Lottery. The Department of Liquor and Lottery would run an RFP competitive bidding process to select up to 6 agents. We can also think of them as licensees, but the proper term is agents. It would provide the sports wagering platform, mobile and online exclusively, within the state of Vermont. Within the bill, there are primary legislative policy decisions made. Those policy decisions were taken from a previously introduced bill, S-79, that was Senator Sears, Senator Sorokin, and Senator Pearson, perhaps one other, as a co-sponsor. Within those primary policy decisions, you have market parameters and restrictions. So there's definitions for prohibited sports bettors that restricts who's allowed to engage with the market. It sets the minimum age for wagering, again, another restriction. It also excludes certain events, such as high school sports events. In the larger scheme of things, that affects the factor of the liquidity of the market. So how much these agents will be able to engage with the potential wagering market in Vermont, and outlines what is prohibited activity and what is allowed. The bill would direct DLL to adopt guidelines. Guidelines are what DLL currently adopts for the lottery system. It is a different timeline than rulemaking. It is a shorter and more abbreviated timeline than emergency rulemaking. It is still governed by Vermont's Administrative Procedures Act. The potential window for the adoption of guidelines could be as short as 45 days from the time that the authorities range the DLL. Under those guidelines, there are comprehensive requirements built into the bill for the security of the platform, minimum internal control standards. In one instance, GLI, I cannot remember what GLI stands for. It's essentially
good luck.
Yes.
It's sports betting. So there's better be some good luck in there.
Good luck and good intent.
Yes. Good luck.
Technical and accounting control specifications. If you work through that section of the bill and look, there's also integrity monitoring and enforcement requirements. So the guidelines will not be generalized. They will be specific.
So those are specific areas that guidelines are called for.
Yes,
And in perhaps other states, or if given more time and more due process, some of those guidelines would be set in law or by regulation as opposed to procedures or guidelines. What is the transparency or the input or control that the legislature or the public has over those guidelines?
there are two opportunities for public input. So 2 public hearings have to be held. The procedures timeline doesn't require, a minimum distance between those 2 public hearings, but there are 2 public hearings that have to be held. Additionally, this language would require that DLL submit the guideline proposal to the sports betting study committee for review before they adopt the final guidelines. Now, there's a second part of the guidelines built into this language, which is the structure of the request for proposal or competitive bidding process. So DLL is going to have to adopt guidelines for what is going to be required for the applicants in order to be selected as agents.
Does that have to go through, say, a public process?
Yes,
Or what the RFP process looks like? It has to have 2 public hearings?
yes. That's the thrust of the bill. There are enforcement and public records provisions built in here that were in S79 around the confidentiality of data that's collected from waivers.
What about the revenue? How is the revenue set forth in the bill?
Revenue share is a factor that is built into the competitive bidding process. So
We just discussed
So
that.
essentially, you're saying that that is to be determined by a competitive bidding process who the state selects. So is there any reason we wouldn't put a minimum in there that they can't accept a bid for less than a certain percentage of the handle or, or
that is something that you could absolutely do. New York, as a component of their competitive bidding process, had a minimum tax that would be applied. And then they had, through rulemaking, a scored rubric for how many points an applicant would get based on the tax rate they were proposing. The committee asked that I share the draft Legislative Council JFO study. If you go to the New York section of the study, it breaks down that rubric and discusses how that process played out according to statute and rule. And if you go to the New Hampshire section of the study, there is a link directly to the RFP and a copy of the contract for the agent that was selected in New Hampshire. New Hampshire didn't have a minimum tax, but as part of their rulemaking process, they did direct their administrative agency to consider as the primary factor maximizing revenue to the state. And the revenue share in New Hampshire is 51% for online and mobile and 50% for retail.
so we're not talking about retail yet, right?
Not in this.
So
Not yet. Is that envisioned as the next stage?
It was in S79, and here the directive and request was for online and mobile.
So, and that's another question I have in terms of our moving this along quickly. Are we in any way jeopardizing future add-ons, or can these, in your opinion, can these be added on piecemeal? Can we do this first, and then if we wanted to do retail, Keno, or any of that stuff, could we do that later without much loss?
You could absolutely add on those sort of retail kiosk-based games later. And good states to look at right now would be Tennessee and Virginia, where there are mobile and online only markets. And they are studying and looking at how expanding into retail would impact various gaming market sectors. whether it would increase revenue to the state or whether it would, as a cost and regulatory basis, be negative. And they may have more comprehensive studies and information that have come out recently that I haven't seen.
Wait, and I may have asked this question before. When you say 51% or 50% of revenue, you're talking about profit, right? Winnings are the amount of what they keep after they pay out the wagers, winnings to the wager.
It is a very important question, and New Hampshire, I believe that the abbreviation was GGR, gross gaming revenue, and that would be the revenue received by the agent, less winnings paid out, less unclaimed or voided bets, and less federal excise tax. Some states get more specific, and they allow for deductions when the agent is giving out promotional tokens. Things like that, but
Do any states just do a straight like sales tax or service tax on the amount of the bets?
I would have to go back through the tax sections of the study, state by state. It's not ringing any bells off the top of my head. For the most part, they look at adjusted gross sports wagering revenue.
And is there a massive like auditing function here? I mean, this is huge amounts of money following the bets versus the payouts. And are there significant dollars put towards oversight? And
There's no specific call for an auditing requirement within the procedures at this stage. The GLI standards that are referenced in subdivision B2 within section 1303 does have some reference to auditing and more specific to the technical specifications of the system to be able to keep comprehensive logs that can be audited. And if you look through the draft study, audits in this market are split between technical and systems audits versus financial controls and financial audits. On that side, the financial control, financial audit, it would also be built into what's known as minimum internal control standards that could be applied to the agents.
good.
Well, I don't know what your time is here, but
I'm going to only do this for 15 minutes.
okay. I mean, at some point, I just, the technical audits, I know a lot of these systems are relatively new, right? What's the oldest online betting system state that's been here for the longest? What's the most established?
You got me on that about what the oldest online and global gaming system would be.
Well, the reason I ask, I have a reason. The reason I ask is when you look at these audits, I would think that the financial audits would probably be more straightforward than the technical audits, and that the technical audits would be possible ways that money is also diverted. I mean, that is where you control the money flow. So it would strike me. I was just curious if any states have had any challenges with any of that, because that strikes me as.
To be honest, one of the most complicated areas around that is where the technical specifications dovetail with the financial and accounting records, because essentially you need, with the amount of wagers, let's say in a large state with a robust, betting pool, Tennessee, you have, very detailed requirements for when an individual log or entry needs to be corrected or amended or disregarded as part of the final system audit.
Yeah, no, it
That's
strikes me
the
this
most-
audit piece is huge, quite frankly.
Now, typically, those specifications are dealt with in rule where there's more fungibility rather than in legislation, because the technology around this changes so rapidly that dealing with it at the legislative level would be cumbersome.
So,
You mentioned earlier minimum internal control standards. Where are those? Who sets those?
So if you look state to state, statutes typically require that there are minimum internal control standards that are applied to, for example, accounting systems. Some states become more stringent and specific at the statutory level. For the most part, the minimum internal control standards are determined by rule that sets out what has to be submitted, and then they're
So it's not,
adopted.
in other words, an industry standard set of internal control standards or some standard setting body that sets internal control standards.
There are, yeah.
Yeah.
So the GLI and a few of the other industry, standard groups do have MICs
Okay.
that can be adopted and probably are already implemented by the major players that are universally, acceptable under those regulatory standards.
And so some states have simply adopted a minimum internal control standard set by some standard setting agency or some specific group. Is there any consistency, or are they wildly inconsistent across the states?
It varies. So the GLI standards are built in here because there were at least 3 or 4 states that in their adopted rules pulled the GLI standards and said, you have to meet this. An example is South Dakota off the top of my head. Some states are more granular and specific, and that would primarily be Nevada and those who have adopted the Nevada model. So they have an entire rule, I believe it's Rule 6 under the Nevada standards. They govern minimum internal controls, and they're very specific.
Have any states like partnered in any of this? I know we have like these joint lottery games. Have any states partnered in terms of technology or auditing or anything like that?
Not to my knowledge, and there's some trickiness with federal law there. And there are quite a few law review articles that have looked at, for example, pooling systems that have been set up by some of the players in this market to ask whether there are potential violations of the Wire Act there.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to ask you or whoever you brought here to testify next. One of the things that I've heard, I think, is that there's different models, the state-controlled model, and I'm not sure what we've heard so far about the state-controlled model. Put it out to bid to 6 private companies is, I think, a state-controlled where they actually have the hands-on. It sounds like just contracting it out, so I'm trying to understand the difference. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
John Mandel on behalf of the Sports Betting Alliance. We're a coalition of the leading mobile sports betting operators in the country. Yes, there are a number of different models, and we obviously appreciate your continued interest in this topic. I monitored the previous hearing, and I know there were sort of some outstanding policy questions that we wanted to sort of address. On the revenue side, number one, we feel very confident that a competitive model with a minimum number of operators as opposed to simply a cap with a reasonable tax rate will generate not only the revenue that the governor had anticipated in his original proposed budget, but what the lottery has certainly been forecasting as well. And 2, in terms of speed, I know that was important. There was thoughts about.
So let me just stop you so we're all on the same page. So the difference in a public model and a competitive model is a limited number of bids versus the maximum number of bids, but both a bidding process. Just a question of how many bids.
Yeah, let me take a step back.
Okay.
You could, in one model, Tucker mentioned Tennessee and Virginia. Those are lottery regulated mobile sports betting markets where it's licensed. The alternative is a request for proposal, the RFP process we're discussing today in this language. While it says up to 6, there's no floor amount of licensed bids or agents that could receive a contract. So, for example, in New Hampshire, similar situation, there's a discretion of the lottery to determine how many to simply award. And that has led to New Hampshire, for example, just 1. And so
They chose just one operator?
chose one operator. And that's why, we submitted comments in March that, depending on if you do approach this through the RFP process or direct licensing, that there be a set floor number of licenses, as well as a tax rate that's set in the statutory legislation. And there are a couple reasons that I'm happy to talk about, for the public policy reasons. As we know, and we talked about some of the sort of numerous options you have right now through the illegal offshore market. If you Google Vermont and sports betting, 6, 12, the number's quite high of how many illegal offshore websites are available right now in Vermont. So what we know is consumers want choices, just like in sort of any other market. Sports betting is no different. So we believe that there should be a minimum number of options available for Vermont so that they have competitive choices, which means better products, an incentive on the operators to deliver better prices, as opposed to one company that operates the entire sports betting platform. And that will attract more folks from the offshore market and just provide a much more engaging experience.
Is the situation in New Hampshire one where they have the ability to, through the RFP process, to extend more than one operator, but they should have chosen not to?
That's my understanding. I believe the lottery director of New Hampshire is going to be speaking about that.
And the licensing option, that would get you into a situation where you would have more than one, because if you qualify for a license, you could have 15 if they all qualify. But I guess that's not the greatest scenario for speed to market.
Well, and I know the Wyoming commissioner is going to be speaking later today. There's a great example. In fact, I think they beat New Hampshire to the market, even though it's not for an RFP process. They have currently 3 operators, and I believe there are more applications pending for licensing in the state. And the way, whether you do it through an RFP process or direct licensing, but specifically through a direct licensing process, what is available to help the speed to market is temporary licensing issuance. In other words, there are operators who have been vetted through the due diligence process in other states where they've been licensed and regulated. And as probably can tell, now that you're all subject matter experts in this topic, it is a thorough process. And so what states have done is they have offered temporary licenses to mobile sports betting operators who are licensed and regulated in other states. And while they continue the sort of internal state due diligence process, they allow these operators to operate. And from my understanding, there hasn't been an issue at this point where these vetted operators who, without sacrificing many important consumer protections and just the rules and regulations that are developed by the state, there haven't been issues with issuing them a temporary license while they await a final decision on the actual license to operate in the state. So that helps, in fact, probably faster than the RFP process. And one other thing to sort of highlight is, there are some of the positive benefits that have been highlighted about the RFP process is this very high tax rate, very high revenue by ultimately just deciding to go with one operator and speed to market. But there are also circumstances where one operator may not necessarily provide those benefits to the state. And the best example I can think of is my native hometown of Washington, D.C., which has one operator currently that is Intralot, and they offer a 57, I think, % tax rate or something well above 50%. It took them 18 months to launch since the bill was signed into law in DC. It was promised that they would generate $92 million in 4 years. That was what the CFO of Washington, DC projected. In
In how
year,
many years?
in 4 years.
To the revenue to the district.
Yeah, to the district.
In year one, they generated $0 as a result of the delay. In year two, I think it was 350,000. In year three, they lost $4 million to the city. And the most recent incident, I would be remiss if I didn't point this out, and one of the challenges of having a single operator is they weren't able to offer the mobile sports betting app via the iPhone, which is, as we know, the most popular phone these days, hands down. And as a result of that, there was no sports wagering before and during the Super Bowl this year due to technical difficulties.
Yikes.
And
Here, this.
ultimately, Intralot paid the districts $500,000, and $400,000+ of that, evidently, the lottery director recently sort of testified, was to help with improvements in reputation and marketing to cover the loss of what was at stake due to not being able to perform during the Super Bowl, which we know is the most important event in sports wagering. So, we're obviously
In
here
America.
in America. I can't say how it compares to the World Cup final, but
It doesn't.
yeah. And, we obviously think there are ways that an RFP process could work and be beneficial to Vermont with the parameters we discussed, which are having a minimum number of licenses issued. We don't certainly advocate for caps, but we recognize obviously that is something that happens in a number of states. Virginia, I believe, they recently increased their cap, but I think originally they had a minimum of 4 and then a maximum of 11, but there was the minimum amount. And Tennessee, for example, does not have a cap on the number of mobile operators. So we think if the state does choose to advance, the committee is interested in advancing an RFP or a direct licensing system, we would respectfully recommend that they consider adding a minimum number of licenses or agents and setting a tax rate into the legislation. And obviously, we recognize, of course, how topical this industry is. You hear about it on the news, you hear about it in conversations. And part of that obviously is due to the sort of states with historical gaming that are, sort of implementing these. And nearby states, for example, obviously, Massachusetts and Maine are considering this. They both have historical gaming casinos and the like. So while obviously, as an organization, we advocate for the benefits of legalizing and regulating it, but if the committee doesn't think that the parameters we discussed are haven't decided those, we would recommend that the committee consider the study group as an alternative to sort of vet through the sort of other frameworks if there's still some uncertainty on what the best model is for Vermont.
So in New Hampshire, you believe, are we having New Hampshire commissioner coming in or somebody?
Yes, I think we do.
Okay, so we can ask them whether this is a policy, even though they have the ability to go beyond one, whether they knowingly and willingly stayed at one. Did you guys bid on that one contract?
Well, some of our members did, and one of our members does operate.
Which is the one that got that?
That would be DraftKings, who is a member of the Sports Betting Alliance, which is, as an organization, is advocating for a minimum number of licenses.
Okay. Let's take a break now. I'm hoping we can get Commissioner Bolio. No? Should be. We're going to come back to this probably a little after 10. So for folks who can stick around, I'm going to very narrow window to talk about the SALT deduction. I want this committee to have some working knowledge of that because we're moving in the direction that before third reading on the 159, if the committee is inclined, there's two possible avenues to take on that amendment, not too dissimilar to this. One is just to study and lose over the next year, or to see if we want to push forward with something that we can help small businesses pretty much immediately.
That's the sole.
So,
And,
so we've heard about it in finance. And
yes,
we're
and we
very
have
interested.
it.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And that's why I have like a half hour scheduled on.
Okay, so are we gonna actually take a break now or just a break from this subject?
Just taking a break from the subject, I was
Right.
hoping we can move right into this. Do you know what his schedule is?
And he told me 9:30. You'd be here.
Who's he? Okay. Right, and Abby's here.
Let's, what's that? I was coming right now. Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bowley, we've devoted a half hour here for you and Abby and Graham to
Is he actually here?
sort of give us the presentation that we received in finance. Senator Brock and I.
Is he actually with us?
There we go.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Senator Brock and I are very interested in moving this forward. The investment group would be to set something up in H-159, which we're both doing second reading today. We wouldn't do an amendment until Tuesday on this, so we can cross the T's and dot some I's before then. But really to continue to work on it while the bill is in conference over the next couple of weeks to see if we can get people's comfort level enough so that we can garner some revenue from this tax year for small business. If not, we'll be one step forward, I think, towards doing it in 2023, but you certainly piqued our interest in, as you described it as the new Wayfair. We thought that we should see if we, with some concerted effort, it's not without concern, though, believe me, to move this fast on my part, but I feel like even to do this floor amendment over the weekend, I need my committee to get up to sort of the level of where finance is, because we're putting it on an economic development bill. And I truly feel that this is economic development, especially how it will help small businesses in the state.
So, and happy tax day, Craig.
Oh, is it the 15th?
It's the 15th. Woo-hoo!
It's the 18th this year, so almost Monday.
But the 15th is always really tax day.
I'm just happy to be back to a normal year where it's in April and it hasn't been changed in the middle of tax season. It's been a tough shift. Are you starting with me, Mr. Chair, or are you having?
Yes, yes, you are
All
a
right.
lead door witness in the next half hour.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to members of the committee. Yeah, I don't get to speak with you folks very often, and I've got a fun one this morning. So for the record, Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner, and I'm here to talk about the SALT cap workaround. And I would call this one of the closest things I've seen to a free lunch in state tax policy. And as the chair put it, it's sort of the new Wayfair, if you'll let me use some tax nerd lingo. Folks of this committee may remember a few years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that you could make internet retailers collect sales tax after all, and virtually every state in the nation passed a law.
We forget it. Those of us on Ways and Means worked on it for years.
Yeah, it was a good deal. And so now this is sort of the new wave across the country in these SALT cap workarounds after the IRS in late 2020 issued a notice dictating that the approach was acceptable to get around the SALT cap. So, some background in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017, that implemented a $10,000 per return cap on the state and local tax deduction, which most people would deduct their state income taxes and their property taxes. And states generally love the SALT deduction because in a simplified way, it has the federal government subsidize a portion of a state's tax capacity, right? For every addition.
Craig,
Oh, sorry.
Craig, tell us what SALT stands for.
State and local tax.
Oh,
So-
right, state, okay. Right.
Yeah, so really, right, what the SALT deduction does is make every additional dollar of state tax that somebody pays, they save at least a portion of that dollar in federal tax savings. And so the fact that there's been a cap on it now has been troublesome for a number of states. And traditionally those have been blue states, Northeast states that may have higher state taxes than other states. And so now states have loved this workaround because it's a way to reinstate the SALT deduction for a share of their population and save that share of the population some money and structure it in a way to avoid a significant hit to state revenues, right? So often when you folks are debating ways to spend resources, taking a dollar or giving a dollar to somebody takes or gives in another area. You can structure this in such a way that basically you would give a portion of your constituents a tax cut, but you'd have the federal government pay for it. And in some cases, you might even have your constituents electing to pay more to the state because their federal savings would more than offset it. And at a really high level, the mechanism is available to owners of pass-through entities, so LLCs, partnerships, S-corps, that have flow-through income. And you stand up a structure by which the entity that would normally pass the income through to the individual level, where the individual would pay personal income taxes, instead pays the tax on that income at the entity level, and then receives a credit on their personal income taxes for that tax paid. And you structure it in such a way that it essentially doesn't impact the amount of state revenues, but it drastically reduces the amount of pass-through income that is distributed at the federal level. So what's the catch, right? I've called it a free lunch. I've said it's the new Wayfair. The challenge right now, as I see it, is that it does take a fair amount of time time and work to structure the system in such a way to be at least revenue neutral. And I say at least because there may be as well ways to structure it to have perhaps a small upward impact on state revenues, but people would still elect it because they would save more at the federal level. And this is the problem. I'll try not to get too far into the weeds, but imagine a pass-through entity with one owner that distributes $1 million. And so without a pass-through entity tax, that $1 million would be passed through and the person would report that on their personal income tax return. They'd probably pay about $80,000 of state income taxes, but they'd only be allowed to deduct $10,000 of that at the federal level. And so they would not be able to deduct the additional $70,000 of taxes paid on their federal tax return. With a pass-through entity tax, you can deduct the full $80,000 that the entity would pay for the pass-through entity tax. And therefore, the federal K-1 would show only $920,000 distributed, thereby reducing federal taxable income by about $70,000. The challenge that exists for state revenues is that if you provide a dollar for dollar credit for that revenue distribution will flow through the state level as well. So your state revenues are also reduced by $70,000 or so, and you're giving a dollar for dollar credit. That's the language that exists in H527 right now. And there's been a couple of ways that I'm aware of that states have worked around this problem. The first way is to require add backs of a portion of the income such that you're not having that reduced taxable income problem. Frankly, as I think through all of those options, they seem like an administrative nightmare, and I would really caution the committee toward that approach. The other way states have done it is they scale down the credit. So instead of getting a dollar for dollar credit, oh, sorry.
Scale down the credit, okay.
Scale down had missed that word, but you said scale down the credit.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, so instead of getting a dollar for dollar credit on your personal income taxes for the amount of pass-through entity tax paid, perhaps you get 80%, 85, 90%, something like that. And states have picked different numbers. Scaling the credit feels easier to administer to me, and so that would be my preferred approach. The challenge is we've not had the opportunity to do that internal analysis and work with JFO to know what the right credit number is to avoid hurting state revenues. And so the big challenge at this point is just how to do that with the amount of time that is left in the session. And the only other thing that I would note in the language of H527 is that when it was originally drafted, it does allow C corporation owners of pass-throughs to elect this treatment. And upon further reflection, I think that adds complexity. And I don't think that that's within the spirit of a SALT cap workaround, which is really for individuals, because C Corps already can deduct the entirety of their state and local taxes on their returns. So my recommendation would be to not allow pass-through entities that have some C Corp owners for that treatment. I recognize that that would create some situations where there are pass-throughs that have both individuals and C Corp owners that would not be able to elect that treatment. But to have entities that do both feels very similarly to me to a structure that we used to have that allowed partial composite filing for non-resident owners. And frankly, it was one of the biggest challenges that my department administered and created a significant backlog. So I would advise against that. And I think maybe the last thing that I would opine on is I've heard some concern about equity, that this structure creates the SALT cap workaround for pass-through entity owners, but it does not create it for wage earners, and that is true. And it's unfortunate, right? I think most states, Vermont included, would rather be in a place where the federal government had not passed this cap and our residents could deduct all of their state taxes on their federal return. But we are not in that structure. And to provide that parity for wage earners would require state resources, where again, this structure can be done such that it doesn't require state resources. So by offering this benefit to pass-through entity owners, you're not taking away, so to speak, state resources from another group. And the other equity issue that I would highlight that I think is just as important is that current law allows our non-resident pass-through owners to take this very treatment today and gain this benefit today. It's called composite filing, and non-resident owners of pass-throughs, of Vermont pass-throughs, must pay what's called non-resident withholding, but they can elect to have that tax paid at the entity level, thereby gaining this treatment already under current law. So, sorry, Mr. Chair.
Is that only non-residents that come from states that have workarounds?
No. So that would be non-resident owners of Vermont pass-throughs today with generating Vermont income. They can elect to pay that Vermont income tax at the entity level and essentially get this treatment.
What about Vermont residents that pay state taxes in other states?
Yeah, so this is a challenge without this structure, because what you're referencing there is what's known as an other state's credit, right? And we have this for Vermonters who work or own a business in another state that pay income taxes there. Our other state's credit is only for taxes paid by the individual. So if we have Vermont residents who have business income, maybe you have a dentist practice or something where one of the dentists lives in New York and the other lives in Vermont, and you're generating New York income, which has this workaround, and the pass-through entity elects that in New York, we are not able to offer that Vermont resident the other state's credit because that was not an individual tax paid in New York. So I think you've highlighted another fairly distinct challenge. As more states around the country, and by my count, I think it's up to 23 now, enact these workarounds, and more Vermont residents who have pass-through entities in other states elect those, we do have a hole in our law now where we do not believe we have authority to offer those taxpayers the other state's credit that they would normally have gotten. If the pass-through entity structure did not exist, that income would have flowed through. In the example I just provided, the owner would have paid New York income taxes at the personal level, and we would have offered them an other state's credit.
So I'm pretty confused at this point, but
Sorry.
are you saying that we have a hole now? Or are you also saying that if we make this change, we can be helping fix that hole as well?
The latter, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we have a hole now for the situation you described, and this and enacting this workaround in Vermont would help shore up that hole as well.
So let me ask a practical question. You raised some really good points about, let's say you did the percentage of the credit. You need to work with JFO to figure out what the right number is. There's a lot of other issues to stand up this program. What if we believed in this program and you just need a few months' time to have all these questions answered and land at the right point? Why wouldn't we authorize that in this legislation so that you could go forward with it and have it retroactive for this tax year?
So I would strongly ask not to have it retroactive for tax year 21. The earliest that
No. I didn't mean 21. I meant for the year
22. Okay, yeah. So it'd be next year's filing. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting idea to me, Mr. Chair. I'm not against it. I might defer to Ledge Counsel about how to structure that language, that authorizing language. The other caution I would give is in talking with my counsel, I don't believe that we would have time to do it through rulemaking. So I don't know exactly how you would structure that discretion to allow us to stand it up, but I'm open to the idea and I'm open to trying to find a way that makes it work and working with JFO over the summer and fall to get it implemented. I'm not aware of a structure like that that's happened before. So again, I might defer to Ledge Counsel on how to do that, but I'm open to the idea if you're interested.
What is the time frame you would need to know the details of the program for to, would it have to get on the tax forms?
Yeah.
Okay, so when would that go to print?
We start that process in August. They don't go to print then, so it doesn't have to be finished, but we would need to know by middle of fall, I would say. So one side of it is getting the tax forms, the instructions and the guidance out, and the other is actually programming our systems. I think that it's feasible, but it would be aggressive, but I think it's possible.
So it seems like a 50-50. I mean, yes, you're right, you get another year if we could do it, but it sounds like there are still quite a few things that you haven't fully ironed out. I mean, it sounds like you're not set to go yet on this, and you have questions still you need to answer. And what's the difference between waiting and getting a full report on how we could do this in January and ready to go in January and enact it versus putting it in play now? I mean, I guess it's 1 year of tax, obviously, that we would benefit from.
Yeah, you lose that year, right? Because if I came with a report in January, the earliest that I would want to implement it at that point is tax year 23, because I wouldn't want to try to implement that retroactive in tax season.
Right.
And
but do you think you have enough? Are you going to be in the next 2 or 3 weeks? Are you going to be sure enough that this is feasible for us to move ahead? And if you get to a point, Craig, in the middle of the summer where you think this isn't feasible, can you pull the plug on it?
So if I was hearing the chair right, I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Chair, but I think what you were saying is perhaps authorizing some discretion that we would have more time than that to work on it. I do think it would be a challenge to have all the questions answered in the next couple of weeks to have it fully packaged and ready to go.
Yeah, I think that we'll have to defer to Abby and maybe some constitutional questions, but I think we can write it in a way where if they're ready, they can go forward, and if they're not, they could certify that they're not ready,
right,
and it just gets delayed.
Right.
So keep it alive, and may take some aggressive work. But I read one thing you sent me, Commissioner, where that a chart of the states, if I read it correctly, they said that Vermont pass-through entities could save $12 billion in federal taxes.
Yeah, and I haven't independently verified that number, but my analysts have done some work to just figure out how much the SALT cap costs from honors, and it's in the hundred. It's over $100 million, I believe. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's a lot. That's for the whole population. So hearing 12 million could save for these business owners doesn't sound unreasonable to me, because that's just a subset of the population. So again, it's real money, and you can do it without taking it out of the pocket of the state.
So Craig, where are the other $78 million? I mean, who else is?
Wage earners.
Okay, I'm confused now, because I thought you just said the people who aren't going to benefit from this workaround would be individuals.
So everyone who benefits from this would be an individual, but it's are you an individual pass-through entity owner, or are you an individual wage earner? This structure works for individuals who are owners, members, shareholders of a pass-through entity.
Which is partnerships.
Right.
Those are the only ones you can use the workaround on.
Right.
So what was the $100 billion figure?
Yeah.
For
Individuals and everyone else.
That's for the entire population of who's getting hit by the SALT cap in Vermont. I think it's more than 100 million. I can get the exact number. I just don't have it at my fingertips.
That's how much they're losing in
So much additional they're paying in federal taxes because of the cap. Yeah.
Oh.
It's a lot of money.
Yep. Well, I think this is doable. I mean, I can't believe we can't write it in a way that we can continue to keep it alive based upon where we are in August. I think we pass other things where we require a certification of some sort.
Before we go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we could write it in a way that
Action.
an effective date of such if this happens, an effective date of this if something else happens. So let's hear from Abby. And you say you need to work closely with Graham is here because you say you need to work closely with JFO on this. And,
Yeah, we always like to get consensus.
Like magic, there's Graham.
I'm not sure, let's talk to Abby for a few minutes first. I'm not sure we need to, the more we can give discretion and triggering based upon reaching some certain position points or confirmation points of what you need, the less we have to put that in statute now, I think. But Abby, can you tell us what you've written as an amendment thus far? I think it's more as a platform to keep this thing alive through conference committee at this point. And maybe we would tweak it some more to get to the point where it actually could be in a position to go in August if all the stars are in alignment.
Okay, so for the record, Abby Shepard, Office of Legislative Counsel. I do have a presentation online that does give an overview if that's useful for the committee. I unfortunately do have to jump off the call in a few minutes, but I don't need to walk through that as the commissioner has provided all that great background, but just so that you know if you want to refresh your memories after this discussion.
Oh, you got it right.
And
Suggesting that you send that to Scott if you haven't.
You can print that out. Oh, great.
the presentation is posted under my name online. In terms of the conversation you've just been having, I do have a few thoughts on I have thought about ways of structuring that, and your question about delegating the authority. There is, first of all, the rulemaking process would be very tight in order to put out enough specificity as to what the tax is and how it applies, who it applies to. I'm not sure that would provide enough time from August in particular until the start of the filing season. That is one concern. My other concern, and you did mention this, Chair Strachan, is that not providing statutory specificity as to what the tax is, the rate, and the structure could provoke some constitutional challenges for vagueness. That's my sort of first concern about contemplating delegating whether the tax even applies or who it applies to wholesale to the tax department. So that's just one, and that could be crafted differently so that some of the basic structures of the tax are set out in statute. So those are a few sort of decision points to make there. What I have prepared and what is based on H527 that was introduced in the House does make a lot of the policy decisions that may not get you to the revenue position that you'd like. So that's where the work between JFO and the tax department is so crucial, to actually look at the data to determine whether the structure, because I can draft whatever you want, but whether that structure actually has the impact fiscally that you want it to. So I'm not sure if that is enough for you to hear from Graham. I apologize that I do have to jump off in shortly, but I really want to be clear that wholesale delegating the authority to the department could have some constitutional issues with it.
What if we made those decisions, but just left
The trigger,
the effective date
right?
to be triggered by some team or experts or the commissioner saying that he has to certify that they're ready to go in 2000 under these provisions. And if he's not, then we'll be back next year to change that effective date of total. We should have a program that's, fine tuned at that point. In some ways,
Yes.
statute, the things that get around the vagueness, but if it turns out that they're wrong or it's not ready to be implemented, it would need the sign off by, I don't know who. I mean, I would think the commissioner, but it could be jointly by the commissioner and JFO or something like that. Would that be a possibility too?
There have been other contingency effective dates throughout the years in tax legislation. I don't know that any of them were, I'm thinking of actually Wayfair and some of the click-through nexus. Not sure if those were all repealing taxes or any. Wayfair was a contingent sort of kicking in that remote sellers would have to start collecting. So that would be imposing a tax. I think there is a way to do that. Again, the concern would be about the timing and the legislature not being in session. But there might be a way to have sort of a consensus between JFO and the department, and then perhaps some sort of e-board reporting, since they do meet in the summer. I don't know if that would be one sort of timeline to hook that to. So that is possible. I would, again, just my concern about the constitutional aspects was maybe to provide as much clarity and specificity about, at least choose some of the policy, make some of the policy decisions about how the tax would be structured in statute, and then have that contingency date, and then the legislature will be able to come back and change anything in next year's session.
So when you prepared for me thus far, what essentially does that do? Because essentially I think we're looking for next Tuesday is to put an amendment on 159 that just keeps this issue alive in the conference committee. So even if it's a study of the issue or something like that, I think that's enough to give us another week or 10 days to put our minds together as to what the best direction for final provisions. I don't see this as being controversial. I think I see it more as being lacking in due diligence maybe, but I don't see why anybody would take it back on saving Vermonters $12 million in taxes.
I think it is very complex. There's so many moving parts that's where, as you said, due diligence, there's just so many different policy decisions with different, particularly revenue implications, that it does need some more, I think a little more analysis. So if you would like, I would be happy to draft, I guess, sort of placeholder language that would, to start with, be more of a study requirement over the summer and then evolve it from there. Is that what you would like, Chair Strachan?
I think so. I thought you had drafted something that actually went a little further, but had it starting in 2023. So there would be
Yes, so that was based on H527. So it was a very similar construct, but with a few changes to particular regarding C corporations so that they could not take the credit, and it was taking effect later, 1 year later.
Can you do both and send it to Graham and to the commissioner what you've got, and let's keep talking maybe on Monday.
Okay, excellent, and thank you. I apologize. I do have to leave the call.
We apologize to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Do you have anything more you want to add at this point, Commissioner?
No, I'm happy to take a look at those drafts. You know, conceptually, off the cuff, I think I'm also open to an idea that starts it in tax year 23 with us studying and coming back and making sure it's revenue neutral. I can be open to an idea where there's some kind of contingency. It's a little, the uncertainty could be challenging for taxpayers if they don't know that it will be active or not in tax year 22. My counterpoint to that, and I've got to reserve a little bit of ability to wiggle out of this maybe later, because I'm just thinking out loud, but part of the counterpoint to that is that this policy doesn't really hurt anybody, right? Like, this would be elective. So, it does, I don't know. I can see an argument to both sides, right? You don't want to lose the year of having this structure if you don't have to. But there's also some uncertainty doing it contingently, but
Right.
It doesn't hurt anybody if this ends up going into effect. It only helps people, right? So that doesn't feel like a huge downside. I think if I were to ask businesses who may be able to benefit from this, would you rather it be effective for 22, but it may not go into effect, or just wait until 23? I suspect they would say, well, I'd love if there's a possibility for it to go into effect for 22. I'd rather do that, but I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to constituents.
So one last question for you. Representative Canfield put in H527. Was that at the request of the administration?
That was something that we had talked about. Admittedly, that was fairly early language, right? I think Build Back Better was even being discussed. So we weren't sure if the feds were going to change the salt cap workaround at that point. They ended up not doing that. So that does have some of the language that was recommended by the administration, but a couple of tweaks I do think are necessary. The scale down of the credit, and again, the exclusion of C Corps, I think is worthwhile.
So it sounds, other than the administrative and the quickness of this happening, this is an administration bill that they would like to see happen. It is.
Yeah, the administration is supportive of the structure.
Graham, do you have anything you want to add? We're going to go back to sports betting in a second.
Maybe you'd like to join us in that conversation.
For the record, Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. I posted a document on the committee's webpage that basically highlights the potential beneficiaries of a state and local tax cap workaround. I can present that, or I can come back another time, or I can just leave it there for reference.
Let's just leave it there. We can take a look at it. We appreciate it. We're running on a tight schedule this morning, so I think we know what our charge is between now and Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Abby. Oh, Abby's gone. Thanks, Craig.
It's good to see you folks. Be well, everybody.
Yeah, good to see you. Good luck on this exciting day.
Thank you.
Even if it's not all coming to you today. You feel the need for a 10-minute break? Oh.
Yes.
What? A moment to stretch would not go astray.
Let's just go to 10:15 then.